Imagine it's a bright sunny afternoon in 1962. You sit down and turn on the television, and this is what you see.
You might call this a college town, communist style. As part of a long-range plan to destroy our free way of life, these young communists are studying the economic, political, and religious institutions that are the very heartbeat of America. They're studying you, the way you talk and think. They're becoming acquainted with supermarkets, baseball games, and hot dogs, with all the precious freedoms which Americans so casually enjoy.
Эти американские папиросы, они очень хорошие.
Speak English, comrade. Remember, that is about the only freedom you do not have in this town. It's American town.
Americans, they have too many freedoms.
That is another thing you must remember, comrade. For one day it will be your mission to destroy those bourgeois capitalist freedoms.
Pause the video and complete your lesson preview question. So, historians, what'd you think? This clip comes from a short film titled Freedom and You, which was funded by the US Department of Defense and produced by an American film studio. As you could see, it didn't shy away from portraying so-called communists as threats to the safety of the United States and to American culture in general. And it wasn't the only one. In fact, this is just one of many films, books, and articles that American institutions and authors have produced with the intention of vilifying communist ideology and its supporters. You see, since the mid-19th century, people who have either self-identified as or been accused of being socialist or communists have found themselves persecuted by American mainstream society and even the US government. Pause the video and examine the primary source before you answer the analysis question. For many of these people, their political beliefs and identities cost them their job, their reputation, and even their freedom. In today's lesson, we'll learn how the US government leveraged anti-communist and anti-socialist sentiments to deprive individuals and groups of rights guaranteed by the US Constitution. Let's take a look at our guiding questions. What are socialism and communism? When did socialism and communism emerge in the US, and how did different groups respond? How were the freedoms of socialists and communists restricted during the first Red Scare, and what were the moral arguments used to do so? And our lesson essential question: how has the evolution of the moral and social acceptability of communism and socialism affected the application and interpretation of the First and Fifth Amendments? Socialism and communism first emerged in the US in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. However, they were originally popularized by German economist Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, following a series of economic revolutions in Europe in 1848, which were in response to the poor economic and social conditions of the Industrial Revolution. So, what exactly are they? Communism and socialism are economic and political ideologies that seek to establish a society where resources and wealth are distributed evenly among citizens. While they are similar, they differ in how this goal is achieved. Let's start with socialism. The main goal of socialism is to ensure that wealth and power are distributed equally among people. To achieve this, socialism advocates for democratic control of the means of production. In other words, factories, land, and resources should be owned and controlled by the community as a whole instead of by private individuals. So instead of some people being very rich and others very poor, everyone should ideally have roughly the same amount of wealth and power. Think of socialism like a soccer team. On this team, all equipment like balls, jerseys, and the field are shared among all team members. Instead of one player owning the ball or deciding who gets to play, everyone on the team has a say. This way, there's not just one player who controls everything, but rather everyone shares control and benefits equally. Ideally, everyone shares control and benefits equally, but that only works if everyone cooperates and works together. Next is communism, which is oftentimes viewed as a more extreme evolution of socialism. The ultimate goal under this system is a classless, stateless society where everyone lives in harmony without the need for laws or enforcement, as everyone naturally works for the benefit of the whole society. Communism advocates for a society where not only are the means of production commonly owned, but there's also no need for things like money, classes, or states. Everything is shared equally among all people, and everyone works according to their abilities and receives according to their needs. So imagine communism as an even more cooperative soccer team. Here, not only is the equipment shared, but there's no need for captains or even set positions. Everyone plays where they are best and contributes according to their ability while receiving support according to their needs. There is no single star player or captain, as everyone works together for the good of the team. If you've ever been a part of a team or group project, you might be thinking that this is pretty challenging. Now, these are basic definitions for these two systems. Different countries and leaders have had different interpretations of socialism and communism, leading to mixed results. Let's stop and review for a second. What are socialism and communism? In the United States, early reactions to socialism and communism were generally negative. These collectivist philosophies clashed with the ideals of individualism, free enterprise, and private property that many saw as essential features of American society. However, that didn't stop some of their ideas from gaining some popularity, particularly among labor unions and immigrant groups. This popularity even led to the emergence of socialist and communist parties in the US that advocated for improved labor rights, social ownership of industries, and other progressive social reforms. But for many, including industry leaders and institutions, socialism and communism were still seen as threats to the US capitalist system and the American way of life. This fear was heightened during particular moments of US history when many Americans were afraid that these ideologies would lead to radical, possibly violent societal change. These fears often led to the suppression of socialist and communist activities, setting a pattern that would repeat throughout US history. Before we get into the details of that suppression, let's review. When did socialism and communism emerge in the US, and how did different groups respond? One of the most prominent waves of political persecution against alleged socialists and communists occurred between 1919 to 1920, a period also known as the First Red Scare. The First Red Scare was characterized by a heightened fear in the United States against perceived threats of communism, socialism, and radical anarchism after a communist revolution in Russia. This fear was leveraged to restrict constitutionally protected freedoms, particularly those provided by the First and Fifth Amendments, in the name of preserving American values and averting the danger of these foreign ideologies. These restrictions on constitutionally protected freedoms were on full display during the Palmer raids. Led by Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer between November 1919 and January 1920, over 10,000 suspected communist and socialist radicals were arrested. Although the Fifth Amendment guarantees individuals cannot be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, that was precisely what happened for many of the accused. Individuals were often arrested without warrants or based on flimsy or non-existent evidence. Many of the victims were questioned using invasive interrogation tactics and without being informed of their right to remain silent or their right to legal counsel. Many were also held for extended periods without even being charged with a crime. As a result of these tactics, thousands of people were deported without trials. These deportations were not for specific illegal actions, but simply because of a person's political beliefs or associations. The people arrested were targeted for their criticism of U.S. policies, advocacy for workers' rights, or association with socialist or communist parties, which essentially criminalized their speech and political beliefs, violating their First Amendment rights. Many of these arrests also took place during meetings or gatherings of groups, which violated participants' rights to peacefully assemble. Palmer's actions were supported by many American institutions and groups. The raids exemplify how anti-communism, marketed as a moral defense of American democratic and capitalist values, was used to justify censorship and suppression of any political expression deemed too radical by mainstream American society. Before we wrap up, let's review. How were the freedoms of socialists and communists restricted during the first Red Scare, and what were the moral arguments used to do so? So, when you hear the title Freedom and You, do you think about the dangers of communism, or about how your own freedoms can be limited based on what's morally acceptable in the community and times you live in? Whether you're a supporter or an opponent of socialism or communism, these examples serve as an important reminder about how a society's ideas of morality, legality, and justice can evolve and influence one another within a society. In the next lesson, you'll have a final opportunity to reflect on the relationships among these ideas even more deeply. Until then, keep making history.
Hey!